next one.
Yeah, so why did you want to bring up this particular article, Anna?
So this article is about the efforts of the International Maritime Organization to regulate autonomous ships. The IMO, that's the specialized agency of the United Nations for shipping. And 5 years ago, autonomous ships was simply a non-issue in that organization. And within only 5 years, the regulation of mass turned into the main regulatory project of the IMO. And that's because autonomous ships is no longer, a vision of the future, but it's already a reality. There are increasingly reports about successful trials. I just read that there has been a 10,000 kilometer voyage, fully autonomous, by a cargo ship. And for instance, Japan announced to have half of its cargo ship autonomous by 2040. So there is an imminent need for regulation. And why is there a need? Because if there is just one truism in the law of the sea for the last thousands of years, it's that a ship has an onboard crew, and with autonomous ships, for the first time, you have ships without crew on board. And with this, essentially, the assumption on which the entire law of the sea is built is kind of no longer fulfilled. And this also holds true for maritime security, which I'm mainly interested in. The assumption has been that offenders would be on board ships, enforcers would meet suspect at sea, they would board a suspect ship, they would exchange physical documents to prove nationality of the ship, they would interrogate suspects, etc. So there would be human-human interaction, physical documentation, but with autonomous ships, you simply don't have an offender at sea. Offenders may act from dry land. Autonomous ships may no longer have certificates on board, but function with e-certificates. So everything changes from how you handle cargo ships, who is a seafarers, up to maritime security issues in how do you board an autonomous ship, and does it make sense to board an autonomous ship if there is no person on board? And so the IMO started to regulate these ships, and just last week there has been a meeting by a working group discussing terminology which is basic but essential, such as what is a master? If the master is no longer on board, can a remote operator be a master? Traditionally all function has been incumbent on one single person, the master. He was in charge of everything. Is that also the case with remotely piloted or fully autonomous ships, or can that role be split? And if so, who would be the interlocutory for enforcers, etc.? All of these issues have to be discussed and are currently discussed. And this article is also interesting from a regulatory perspective, because it's true that new technologies have always been the driver for new roles within IMO, but autonomous ships are somehow peculiar because it's a technology which is still in development. So for regulators, it's kind of difficult to grasp what they should regulate, because the end product is not yet there. And it's also difficult to understand when one should regulate these ships, because if you regulate them too early, you risk to lock in the technology through your regulation. And if you don't regulate, you risk to hamper innovation, because investment is only done if you're certain that your product will be lawful. And so there's a bit of a paradox. You should wait and hurry at the same time. And so the IMO has chosen a non-binding instrument, which is much more flexible than hard treaty law, which is a very rigid and slow process. So the IMO has chosen a soft law approach, which allows to make first regulatory experience and then to integrate all that experience in a binding code, which will only be issued at a later stage. So it's both from a substance point of view, but also from a regulatory approach view very interesting. What's going on within IMO?
Yeah, so actually, before we go to Sean's response to that, we've got a question from the chat. Mason Jar M. If there's no crew, what steps would be taken to protect the cargo or vessels from potential hijackers?
That's a great question.
Yeah, so like you've seen people can, even on a less kind of consequential, um, arena or vector, you've seen people actually just tamper or play around with automated vehicles. We actually brought that up too, where you'll purposely step in so they can't go forward. So it would make sense that if the cargo is valuable, why wouldn't I just board the ship if I'm not expecting anybody to be combative? So
Exactly. And also, in case of boarding an autonomous ships by an enforcement team, there's also the risk that, the ship just sails away together with the boarding team so that they also get hijacked. That was expressed by a commander, and I thought, yes, true. So you have entirely new scenarios which were not neither regulated nor like in operations. You didn't face them so far, and of course you could also hijack a ship by cyber means, so deviate cargo. You would maybe not even have to go on board, but you could just use cyber means to hijack it. So
yeah.
yes, entirely new scenarios, lots of challenges for existing one.
Cut the link home and redirect the ship back to your shore.
You can absolutely do that. I mean, actually, there's documentation that Russia, in the Black Sea, there was an exercise going on, some U.S. forces and partner forces, and, the Russians spoofed some of the PNT signals, right? Position, navigation, timing, GPS. And all the people on the ships thought it looked like they were parked at an airport on land. So, I mean, how hard would it be to hack into one of these systems and, like you said, Mike, just redirect it to your port, to your little area where you can then offload this precious cargo and, just take over the ship. So, a whole different level of piracy, I think, will come about because of this.
And fun fact, after that incident you just described, they reintroduced in some curricula navigation by using traditional means, because you saw that GPS is maybe not always the most reliable tool to navigate.
Yeah, people whipping out the maps, right? Like, like in Pirates of the Caribbean, they're sitting in the captain's area, like with the maps. Yeah.
Yeah, too mutable. Digital data can be manipulated. So, Sean, what's your take on this?
Well, off of that, I mean, obviously you have the cybersecurity issue, which allows you to hack, and then you cross back into the legal aspect, right? You have different jurisdictions. So I could just take it to where my jurisdiction's most favorable. So, unlike, right now where a pirate has to, board where it is, I can move that thing anywhere I want. So I think that's interesting. The other thing I think is interesting looking at this as this becomes adopted at a higher level, we're looking at this as well at different offshore energy facilities. I'm curious to see what the transition is going to look like when we move to an actual ship that is not made at all for humans to be on it, or crew, because right now what we're doing is we're automating a lot of what already exists and it's being retrofitted or changed over. So I think it's going to be interesting to look at how these facilities are built, so where they would never have a crew. So then how does that aspect relate back to, once again, if you had to put a boarding party on there or had to put a crew, how is that going to work if it's built for that not to ever occur, for it to be maximized for automation? So I'm intrigued to see how that's going to play out as well.
Yeah,
I would love to jump in here, Mike, if you don't mind, and then, close it out. I think it's also going to be a great segue to your next article, because we're talking about some trucks that were configured with absolutely not to have a driver, right? What Sean just said. So, I think, the key is going to be, how the IMO and how others view this, because like I just said, the FAA decided we're going to create a whole new rule because I see a lot of parallels here, Anna, to aviation, where of course those preeminent safety concepts like see and avoid, right, giving right of way to other aircraft, which of course you have a similar thing in the law of the sea. Um, you know, once drones were created and there was no pilot on board, they really had to step back and say, can these rules still apply? And I think what they found was, it was a blessing and a curse to do Part 107, because it was a whole new rule, but then having to adopt some of these other, like Part 135 for example, commercial deliveries with drones, and how tortured that has been. So I think there are a lot of parallels and lessons to be learned in the sea community by looking at what is happening in aviation and seeing, hey, what worked, what worked well, what could we do better or different than what they did. I think that would be a really interesting discussion. I don't know if those kinds of thoughts have crept in, or if everybody in those rooms, Anna, are like, so locked into the law of the sea and that background that they don't maybe have the aviation people at the table, because and also, as Sean mentioned when we first started, these systems are going to be multimodal. At the end of the day, like, there's going to be things launching from these ships in the air. There's going to be things underwater. There's going to be absolutely a ground connection. When you get to port, a robot's going to come and offload the cargo. I have no doubt about all of this. And I think having all the right voices at the table would be useful.
Absolutely. I guess right now there's a little bit of a silo discussion, like the maritime lawyers, the law of the sea lawyers, the aviation lawyers, they just discuss amongst each other. And I guess it would be very wise to have more like cross-cutting discussions and discussing transversal issues instead of just areas of the law. But yeah, the IMO, that's a specialized agency. You mainly have people from transportation offices from their respective jurisdictions. So, people need to be highly specialized, but that also prevents, like, crossing into other fields. So there are pros and cons if people get highly specialized too.
Yeah, hopefully sometimes we'll be able to bring people together. Like, I know I'm excited, next June we're going to be doing the energy version of Law Tech Connect, and that exact thing of cross sector is what we're hoping to do. We're hoping to have both the maritime, the subsea, the aerial, everyone who's involved in legal aspects as it pertains to automation and robotics. So I think, at least from a sector perspective, we're hoping to be able to cross some of those boundaries, because I think it's absolutely right, Don. People are going to be talking about this and have a need for these cross jurisdictions to be able to work together.
If anything, I would think the emphasis on cross jurisdiction is a little bit higher in terms of maritime for automated technologies. Because if we look at drones, ultimately you have to deal with the drones within your airspace. You're not as concerned about drones that are flying cross jurisdictions, unless you're talking about the European Union, in which case it's a union and it's already discussing within itself. Whereas maritime law could get pretty contentious if we're talking between countries that are adversarial, but they've agreed to some form of free trade. So I think this will be a very, very interesting negotiation process over at least the next decade, because we're looking at the technology now and it could already do all of these things, but it's easy to imagine a future where you would want the logistics to be handled by at least a single platform or something, or a single protocol, where even if it's crossing platforms or jurisdictions, we could kind of confirm that this minimum level of data about what the device or what the system is doing is intelligible. So if we do need to intercept for any reason, or somebody does need to take control of a rogue system for any reason, that these standards are established. So I think this is going to be a fun one to watch. Thank you for bringing it up.